All right, hello, this is Greg Sierra. We are continuing with the Lessee lecture note, and we are on example 3. And in this case, we have a lessee finance lease with no residual value. So it's the same base case as before. And let me check something over here. Hold on a second. Let me get this thing out of the way, see if I can grab this. And I want to make sure the mic's on, and it is, so we're good. Okay, take this back out of the way, and let's start with the spotlight. Okay, so it's the 5-year non-cancelable lease, rent payment of $15,000. The lease transfers ownership, has no bargain purchase option, but it does transfer ownership, so it's a finance lease. The incremental interest rate is 10%, and it says we don't know the implicit rate, but in the very next line they give us the fair value. So with the fair value and the payments of $15,000 in advance and no residual value, you could calculate it as 10%. Not really very important here because it's all the same, but just in case you had a problem where you're like, can I calculate the implicit rate? If you have the fair value and the payments and the number of payments, and then you can. Okay, residual value at the end of the lease term is 0. So it's not that it's not guaranteed, there just is not a residual value. Economic useful life of the equipment is 8 years, and it qualifies as a finance lease. Just in case you didn't notice the transfer of ownership, there it is. All right, so in the first part it says calculate the amount of right-of-use asset under the finance lease. So we're just sticking our toe in the water here. There's no executory cost that are fixed in addition to the $15,000. If so, we would have added that to this $15,000. There's no residual value, much less it's guaranteed. So if you had an unguaranteed residual value, you would not include it. And if you find the present value annuity factor 10% and 5 payments, you would find that it's 62,548. So that's it. The present value of so this is the PV, just more broadly. Wow, that is just a terrible pen. That, holy moly cow. Okay, I'm going to have to use the annotator pen. So it's the present value of the GAAP lease payments. So it's the payments that associated with the lease that GAAP says you have to present value. Okay, and in this case, it's just the actual lease payment of 5 payments of $15,000 in advance. Okay, so moving right along, I am learning about PDF annotator versus the, oh, sweet. Okay. Let's see. So the PDF annotator versus the whatchamadoogie, the Zoom pen. I'm going with the PDF annotator. All right, so you take the present value of lease payments and capitalize them. So this is the capitalization. Boy, that's a long word for such a fat pen. But there it is. So you're recording the long-term asset called right-of-use asset. And then along with it, we recognize 62,548. Now, payments are in advance. So on day one, you have $15,000 reduction in lease liability. However, don't be confused. Even though the lease liability balance is reduced by $15,000, the right-of-use asset is a long-term asset and will only be reduced by amortization, which is like depreciation except for financial instruments and intangible accounts. So right-of-use asset is an asset created by a contract. So it's, it's kind of an intangible account, but it's associated with financial instruments. So it's, halfway between a financial instrument and intangible. Regardless, we're going to amortize it. Okay, but for a finance lease, you're going to have interest expense and amortization. All right, so interest expense seems a little bit confusing, but because we just did bonds, or you should have just done bonds, hopefully. We're going to use the same method, the effective interest method, or sometimes just called the interest method. So interest expense equals, and maybe I got to go with that thinner pen here, equals CV, carrying value at the beginning, times the effective VIV interest rate, equals the interest expense, which, so here is this thing here. We initially recognized 62,548, but there was a day one payment. You could possibly get a lease where there's not a day one payment and you wouldn't have that subtraction, but here we did. So this is the carrying value at the beginning times the effective interest rate, and it's 47.55. Now the amortization expense, because there's a transfer of ownership, you divide it by the useful life. So the amortization expense is $78.19. That's an important thing to keep track of. Up above in the lecture note, we have case 1 and case 2. Case 1, the item is returned at the end of the lease. In that case, it would have been 5. But in this particular lease, it's transferred at the end, and we divide it by the useful life. So now what you do is recognize amortization expense of $78.19, and you reduce the right of use asset directly. So notice that we don't have any accumulation account like you do with with the other, like you do with accumulated depreciation. We just reduce the right of use asset directly. And that's what we're going to see later when we study intangible assets. There's no accumulated amortization. You just reduce the asset directly. All right, in the next lecture, we'll show the presentation, but that's the end of this, how to deal with a finance lease without a residual value. And we'll pick up on the next video.